I'm going to, oh, I can't currently share my screen. I wonder if we didn't test that, did we?
Should be able to now, Rachel.
Let me go that again. That's better. Lovely. Right, I shall share my screen and hopefully you will all be able to see my crazy pictures. So, right, hello. So I'm very pleased to be speaking to you tonight on behalf of City of Trees, and I work for the Manchester Museum. We're part of the University of Manchester, and this is, I suspect, an architect's drawing, you know, with those people casually strolling around in the street outside, showing our museum in about the late 1880s. So normally, if I was taking people on a tour, at this point I'd be asking if anyone's been to Manchester Museum before, or whether you're new. But it is one of the wonderful things about these Zoom calls, means that we can have people attend from places that you wouldn't normally be able to come in and visit us in person. So these days there's more buses running up and down here and fewer horse-drawn carriages. But this was originally built as the Natural History Museum of the university to hold the natural history collections. And in my daily working life, I'm normally rattling around up here on the top floors of this museum. But if you know the museum, you'll recognise that it's a bit shorter. So as we got more collections, things like Egyptology and anthropology materials, they built some extensions to these buildings. And courtesy of the same architects who also built the Natural History Museum, the City Town Hall, and also Strangeways Prison, which means you'll be able to see some kind of similarities between all of them. We are currently closed until late May, hopefully, all being well, but we've got lots of things online, including some online exhibitions and further talks. So if you want to find out more about what we do, please check out this website. And I look after the botanical collections. So we've got something like 900,000 objects in the collection, so approaching 1 million out of the 4.5 million total in the museum. And this includes the flowering plants, but also things like mosses and liverworts, seaweeds, also fungi, because the Victorians didn't know where else to put them. And it covers things which are whole plants, like this pressed cactus you can see in the middle. I just can't imagine how anyone went about doing that, as well as microscopic parts of plants, fruits, seeds, and things of kind of economic use, like timbers and these kind of fibres and so on. But it's fair to say that most of our collection is pressed. So pretty much everyone has had a go at pressing a plant at some point or other to make a bookmark or a gift tag or something. But for a herbarium sheet, we have a large scale size piece of paper with pressed plants stuck onto them. Ours are mainly stuck on with strips of gummed paper, but some are stitched and some are glued. And then the really important thing is this data label here. So it says what it is, who picked it, where it came from, and when are the basic bits of information. So it acts as a kind of physical, biological record of where a species was at a particular point in time. So I'm going to play this video. So if I was welcoming you in person to the herbarium, this is where we house our botanical collections. So this is our main room. It's very beautiful and I'm missing it as I sit in my spare bedroom. And this is where we welcome visitors to come in and do their research with us. So we get lots of different people coming in. They might want to do the kind of science of what grew where and when. They might want to look at things and reevaluate whether the identification's right. They might realise that there's a plant disease that's been preserved on the specimens and they want to map how that's moved around through time. Or they might be looking at the social history or the history of things, who knew who was swapping objects and so on. And we get an enormous amount of interest from artists, including from the Manchester School of Art students who come looking for inspiration from the collections to inspire their works. So where we store the collections then is in these thousands of green boxes. That's the advantage of having them flat and pressed, is that they don't take up much space. And these collections are arranged in the rooms around the attic of the museum. And we've got material that really dates from kind of about 1850 through to about 1910. So it's largely reflecting the collecting habits of the kind of wealthier people in Manchester who had the ability to do these kind of pastimes and could spend money on the paper that was required to press these plants. But in and amongst, we've got all sorts of interesting stories of other collectors as well, and their what they were getting up to. So these are what the herbarium sheets look like, and the labels, and you can see that they're not necessarily in English, which is a bit of a challenge to us when we're looking at them. And I'm going to fast forward a bit here because these are all indigo plants, because this was for a student project who particularly wanted to look at indigo. But to show you, as well as the actual pressed specimens, we've got a lot of other material, so kind of illustrations, printed works, kind of accumulation of knowledge around plants and their uses. Again, largely flat. I'm good at flat and often brown. We have things which are grown in gardens. So this is terrible handwriting, but believe me, that says Chatsworth, 1865. Some beautiful illustrations. And then because this is Manchester, we also have quite a lot of fibres, and this is someone's kind of drawer of cotton samples. So I imagine a kind of quality control situation where they're looking to see what grows best where and what it looks like. So a final view then of one of our rooms with some medicinal plant jars, the kind of things that you'd have in a pharmacy counter. And that brings my quick snapshot of the herbarium to a close. So at that point, having introduced me and a bit of what our collections are, I'm going to hand over to Andy now to get us in the mood to start thinking about flowering trees and shrubs. So are you still with us, Andy?
Hopefully I am. Can you hear me okay?
I can,
Sarah,
yes.
if I'm all breaking, oh, fantastic. If I'm breaking up, Sarah, just cut me off and carry on, Rachel. Okay, good evening, everyone. 6 fun questions. It's a quick quiz, just to kind of set the theme and a little bit of an introduction into the rest of Rachel's presentation. So, okay, first question. What is the first native British shrub to flower in the year? So it's a little bit of a trick question because I've used the word flower in its kind of botanical sense rather than the kind of flower that we might think about when we're gifting one or getting cut flowers from the florist. So shall we reveal the answer, Rachel, please?
Yeah. Oh, if I can find my cursor and move the slide. There we go.
So it is actually hazel. So it can be as early as January, more commonly February. It's been out this year. It doesn't produce blossom, but it does flower. It has the tiny female red flowers, and you might be able to make them out on that image there, just above the male catkins that hang below it. Yeah, if you're a hay fever sufferer and you suddenly start sneezing in February thinking what the heck's going on, the grasses aren't out yet, it could well be the fact that you are allergic to hazel pollen, and it's, I think, more common than widely thought. Okay, next question please. Okay, not so tricksy. What is the first native British shrub to blossom? So if we think kind of, it's common in our hedgerows, in our British hedgerows. It can form dense thickets and has some really vicious thorns on it. A few clues. Okay, shall we reveal, Rachel, what it is?
I think we had someone who got the right answer.
I think someone's already flagged it up. Yeah, so it was actually, yeah, so well done to those who got the correct answer. It is Blackthorne. So it has been one of the first things that comes out in our kind of hedgerows. We often see that, you know, in patches, in batches, and in thickets. Unlike some of the other flowering plants, other flowering trees, its flowers come out before the leaves do. So it's not a kind of a handy hint indicator as to what's in flower at that time if there are no leaves on it. Okay, so what is the more common name for the May tree which flowers at that time, so the time in May? So this is another classic hedgerow shrub. It's unlike the blackthorn, it comes out after the leaves are out, so it's another kind of it gives you a bit of a contrast to the blackthorn. Yeah, I can see it's the correct answers are pinging up on the on the chat there. So let's
there we go.
yeah, so it is as those people got it right, it is the hawthorn. So lovely white flowers. It doesn't smell quite as nice as it looks. And I think it's the plant and the flower and all the various bits of it, how it kind of steeped in various bits of mythology and lots of cultural connections there. So it's a really kind of interesting plant. Okay, next question. Japan is famous for its annual celebrations of which flowering tree? So I don't think I need to perhaps, crikey. I think I've made these questions a bit too easy. Everyone's getting them fantastic. Oh, crikey, there's everyone there. Okay, let's put the answer up, Rachel.
I didn't have my own photo of this, sadly.
So it is, as people have rightly correct, put in the quiz in the chat, the cherry. I think considered by some as the national flower of Japan. If you go to any kind of garden centre or tree book and you look at some of the various cultivars, cultivated varieties, you will see a whole host of them with Japanese names. So it's very big in that country. Okay, next question. The flowers of which British native shrub are commonly used to make cordial and even sparkling wine? So I don't drink wine myself, but I understand it's quite nice. So let's have a look. Oh, crikey, yeah, all the correct answers are rolling in. Yeah, it is the elder. So the flowers and berries, well, flowers are used for cordials and wine making. The berries are very rich in vitamin C, though I understand if you were to eat them raw, it would give you a rather unpleasant stomach ache. Although someone else has told me that if you were then to cook it in vinegar, it forms quite a nice kind of balsamic vinegar concoction, although I've never tried it. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Which family of flowering trees was named after French botanist Pierre Magnolia? So it's a little bit of an odd one here. Getting some good answers. Yeah, I don't think I need to give you any clues, do I, with this one? Let's pull up the picture, Rachel. So yeah, it is the magnolia. So it's a common flowering tree. It's actually, that picture is very apt right now. If you have any magnolias near you in public parks or quite often in people's own gardens and private residences, it looks like this at this moment. It's just coming into flower.
Yeah, this one is in Fallowfield, if anyone wants to go find it. It's the university campus.
Yeah, it's flowering now. Yeah,
exactly.
Which native British shrub has bright pink fruits with orange seeds? So this is a bit of an unusual one. It kind of stumps people when they see it perhaps in a natural setting because it looks kind of ornamental. Seeing what's coming up in there in the chat.
Good guesses, but not quite right yet. I think as well, because it's so subtle in flower, people don't notice it earlier in the year until suddenly it's got fruit on it.
Yeah, and we don't see a great deal of it in Greater Manchester, primarily because it's a tree that likes more calcareous soils. Those soils are not so acid, and we tend to have more acidly based soils or now native woodlands across Greater Manchester. So it's not that common a plant we see, but it is a native. So if you were down in, say, East Anglia, it might be part of the more native ancient woodland mixes you might find there. let's get the picture up, Rachel. So it is spindle. Yeah, so it does stand out and look rather weird and wonderful when you do see it, but it is it is a native. It's not a cultivated variety.
And I think sometimes it does get planted in places because it looks so spectacular. So this one was by the side of a reservoir near the Longondale Trail, and I think I have seen it in the Mersey Valley down around near Chorlton Water Park or somewhere once upon a time. So it is, if you see it
a little bit
shining from the hedgerow.
Yeah, it's a little bit an odd one. Also, if it's not in flower or in leaf, or with the fruit there, one of the indicators is the young stems have a very angular, almost square kind of cross section. So that's a kind of another clue if you come across something that hasn't got these very obvious indicators on there. That's another bit of a clue. And I think, are we done with our questions, Rachel?
I think that was all the questions then.
Yeah, so okay, so that's the little quiz over. So I think, by the sounds of it, you are already a very well educated and experienced and knowledgeable lot. So that's enough for me, and I will pass you over to Rachel for more blossom.
Thank you. So obviously I've got 900,000 things in the collection at my disposal, and I thought, yes, I'll do a talk on blossom. And then I started thinking about it, and like, what on earth am I going to talk about for blossom? What is blossom? Because I think I use the word blossoming quite often. I might say that my Christmas cactus was blossoming, for instance, but I don't tend to use that to describe the kind of flower that's there. As we've seen talking about, like, hazel isn't a blossom, for instance. When you say the word, you really think about those big sort of displays, a mass of tiny flowers on a tree and all that kind of colour. So perhaps because I maybe should have worked for my namesake dictionary, I thought I'll have a look and see what it actually defines blossom as. So this definition has it the flower of a seed plant, and I'm really not happy with that, because I'm certainly not calling it blossom on my Christmas cactus. But I did kind of like this part of the description about it being a mass of those flowers on a single plant, because that's kind of got that wow display to it, hasn't it? And then from this other dictionary, I had a look, and it's bringing in some ideas about it being small flowers on a tree or flowers that produce fruits. And I thought, well, now we're beginning to get somewhere a bit more definite about what a blossom might actually be. So I was thinking about when I use the word, and thinking about the kind of trees that I might use it to describe it for. So the first thing that comes into my mind is apple blossom. And then from there, it's an easy kind of step to think about pear. From there, I kind of meandered into cherries and the related sort of plums, that kind of stone fruit, and then onto other kind of closely related trees like almonds and hawthorn and blackthorn, those kind of other trees and shrubs in the rose family. And if I really pushed myself, I remembered that I call it apple blossom water, and so there's all those citrus trees and plants. But that's about it. So if I'm looking at a horse chestnut, for instance, it's got, lots of masses of beautiful tiny flowers, but I tend to call them flowers. I don't tend to call them blossom. And then similarly, if I was thinking about something that I'd eat, like an olive, for instance, I still wouldn't call it blossom on the tree. I'd probably call it flowers on the olive tree. So I realised that when I use the word blossom, I'm really restricting it to very specific spring flowering trees of the rose family, and if I'm pushed, some citrus trees. So first off, I wondered, what do you all think when you're talking about blossom? So we've got a quick poll from Sarah for you to say, do you agree, or do you think I'm absolutely talking nonsense with my definition of what I use the word blossom for? And if you think I've missed out something that's blindingly obvious, drop it in the chat, because I think it's quite an interesting question, really. I suspect there's something quite strongly cultural about it, because I've always lived in Northern Europe. The thing that comes firstly to my mind is an apple. And like if I'd spent more time in Japan or China or somewhere, it might be cherries or plums. If I lived somewhere where mangoes can grow outdoors, would I describe what a mango tree has as blossom, for instance? So I'd be interested to know what you feel about that.
So far, we've got 90% do agree with you and 10% have said no. So it'll be interesting to see what sort of thoughts come through. So yeah.
Absolutely. So for anyone who thinks something else, I'd love to hear what you say, because it's obviously one of those words that's quite kind of flexible in its use, and I think it probably means something slightly different to a lot of us. But a lot of people clearly have lived in the same sort of places as me and think of blossom as being those fruit trees first off. Right. So I thought for this talk I'd talk a bit about science. So first off, I'd think about blossom as that kind of big, wow, showy display of things. So this is a nice apple tree that I once found with another City of Trees colleague of yours when we went round a kind of neglected orchard. And although I said, I know this, I don't count this as blossom when I'm thinking in my head, widening out a bit to more flowering trees. This is the witch hazel that I've got in a pot outside my lounge window to give me a bit of privacy. And so this year has been its most spectacular year yet, I'd say, for flowers, as opposed to something like 2019 when it was absolutely rubbish. And so it got me thinking about the kind of important times of the year for trees and their flowering. Because obviously the thing that was different between 2018 and 2020 was that 2018 was really hot and I was gallivanting about on holiday. Whereas in 2020, yeah, brambles an interesting one. In 2020, I was stuck at home and watering my tree religiously. Because obviously, although what the spring conditions are like is important for what your blossom sort of big reveal is, actually all this stuff is being created in the year before. Which gives me an opportunity to show this little object from our collection, which is a microscope slide, where someone has taken a slice crossways through that big black bud at the top of an ash twig. So if I bring up closer, it's got a really marvelous pattern here, and you can see these V-shaped scales, which would be the black covering to the bud, and inside you can see all these baby little ash leaves and the little leaflets that are making up those kind of really recognizable ash leaves for when this bud bursts open in the spring and turns into a new bit of growth. So a lot of what happens in the spring has already been laid down earlier on in the previous year. And of course, this is something really clever that plants can do, because there was a certain point in my life where my body decided where my right ear was going to be and my left index finger and my nose. And beyond that, I can't change anything. But plants have the ability to put out all these different kinds of organs, whether it's leaves or flowers or roots, all over themselves, because they have these, what we would call in humans, stem cells. So I keep forgetting on Zoom, I can't just press enter, I have to find this little arrow. These cells which are capable of becoming anything else. So this is a slice looking down the length of a coleus stem. So this is the very tip of the stem, and these are the youngest leaves, and these are such young leaves that they're barely leaves at all. But at the top of this stem here, we've got a group of cells which have the ability to become anything the plant needs them to be, which is something that doesn't happen in a human body plan. So it could become a new leaf, it could become a flower, or it could become a root, depending on the right signal it gets to start developing. And so this is obviously putting out 2 new leaves to either side. So you get them at the apex of the top of every stem. You get them in every leaf junction. So this is a little group of stem cells down here. Because they're at every leaf junction, that also means you get them where twigs join onto branches and where branches join onto the trunk. And then, although we're not thinking about it today, you also get it on the root system so that the roots can carry on growing. And the plant stops this being chaos and mayhem by these buds at the top of the stem, this meristematic region here, exerts a kind of top-down control on everything else. So this bud won't do anything because this one here is telling it not to, via some chemical signals. Which is why when you go to prune something and chop the top off, you get a bushy plant because it's lost that control at the top and things start growing outwards. There it is. So that's how you get situations like this. So this is a cherry tree I found on campus, and there's obviously been a little branch here that's snapped off, but those stem cells, which were lurking just beneath the bark in the trunk, have been able to produce blossom on one side and a new stem on the other, shooting out straight from the trunk. So thinking about it in terms of the buds then that are going to happen for the blossom, this is a nice diagram I found from someone's research paper looking at cherry buds over the year. So the cherry tree is starting to produce its flowers and its leaves in its new buds late in the summer, when it's moving sugar from all that photosynthesis it's actively doing in the leaves to produce its new young organs. And then the tree, it's quite nice and warm at this time of year. The tree is going to stop those growing, but they're going to put in some chemical inhibitors perhaps that stop it from doing anything. And then it's going to have all this period of unpleasant winter weather where nothing's going to happen until it starts in late winter and early spring to get the right kind of environmental cues to start them opening and doing something interesting. So for cherries, that involves getting enough frosty cold weather to help break down some of the inhibitory chemicals, and then enough time at a sort of higher temperature so it starts recognizing that it's getting warmer. So it gets to a tipping point where the signals that say stop are lower than the signals that are saying go, and then you get things bursting out into blossom. And coming back to our poor magnolia, that is then something that a tree absolutely wants to get right, because it's still quite a variable time of year, and if you go too early then you are at great risk of all your flowers being damaged by frost, and this being a problem for your later seed set and the success of yourself as an adult plant, as it were. So this is one of the things in trees which is really quite vulnerable to climate change in some ways, because you get either not enough winter. So if you haven't had a really good cold period, that's when you get trees that don't do a show all at once, but they're just putting a bit out here and there because not everybody's got to the same level at the same time. Or generally you end up with trees starting to flower earlier and earlier in the year. So there's been some news this year where they're reporting on some research in Japan about how that peak cherry blossom has been getting earlier and earlier on average for the last sort of 10-20 years. So this was the earliest peak blossom in Japan for the last since records began about 1,200 years ago. So I think we've got another poll at this point, because I wanted to know if anyone has gone to see some of these big blossom shows anywhere. It's something I would love to see. I think there are some in the States. There's some cherry trees that were gifted to New York City, perhaps. And I know they're thinking, the National Trust are thinking of planting a ring of blossom, aren't they, around the south of England for having a kind of similar show in the UK. It's certainly something I'd love to see, but have never had the opportunity, really.
So we've got people voting at the moment. Majority of people haven't. About 84% have said they've never been to one. I was actually lucky enough about, I think it was 10 years ago, to go to Tokyo. I was living out there at the time, and we went in March, and we were hoping that the blossom would be out, but I think it's only a really short time. So good luck, and we were incredibly lucky because we were there for the Blossom Festival. So it wasn't timed, but we just happened to be in Tokyo for it, and it was quite incredible. It was almost like snow, for the parks and everything, sort of like, when it starts to fall, and it is really incredible. And it's incredible seeing everyone out in the parks and taking pictures. A lot of local people enjoying it, which was really lovely. So yeah, I have been lucky enough to see Tokyo and Japan's blossom, but a good 10 years ago. I don't want to think how much longer, but yeah, thanks for everyone for voting. I will share the results of that so everyone can see as well.
There we go. So most of us then will be really pleased to see the blossom happening much closer to home, without that opportunity to travel over to Japan. I mean, certainly I remember I got a new bike. I was about 8 and it was pink. And I got it for Christmas, and I waited until cherry blossom time because there was one of those big cherries at the end of my street, and I was like, my dad, I've got to take a picture of me under the cherry tree with my new bike because it's exactly the right sort of pink. So it is the kind of thing that is quite important to a lot of people without really noticing it, those sort of signs of spring and of coming nicer weather. But I thought I'd share this bit of research that happened at Manchester University a few years ago with one of my colleagues, Professor Enos, who looked at the effect of different trees and their capability for combating climate change as well. So they looked at 5 different trees. I think they had a hawthorn, a kind of mountain ash, a kind of cherry, a type of crabapple, and a kind of pear. And 2 of these were particularly good at cooling the air around them, the hawthorn and the pear. So I think as we look to making our cities more livable, hopefully that means we'll be getting lots more exciting blossom and spring interest around as well. So this, I think, is the right type of pear, though Andy, you can tell me if I'm wrong. This one's growing outside MMU in front of their buildings, and I went there and picked some flowers off it, which I will show you in a minute. So then I thought next up we'd take a look at the individual flower then. So not thinking about blossom as a mass show, but thinking more about it as the individual flower. So from the quiz that we had earlier, we can all agree that this is not blossom. So we've got tree flowers, but they are not what we think of as blossom. And we did, I had a student a few years ago who did a project helping people identify trees with a key. And it was really incredible how many of our museum visitors had never heard the word catkin before. It kind of blew me away because I think it was probably in a lot of stories that I had as a child that perhaps people aren't reading anymore. But so not a hazel tree, but we're thinking more about this kind of thing, which is a nice cherry that I found outside the University of Manchester car park, prettying up the street. And it's a much more attractive flower, and deliberately so because it's trying to get insects to come and visit it to pollinate the flower. So it's got showy petals, changing colours, and a scent that it's giving off, and then it's offering a reward as well into it. Yes, the National Trust Blossom Scheme. I knew I'd heard something. It sounds a brilliant idea, and hopefully things will get big enough that it'll be within our lifetime to go and have a look at some of these things. So just to refresh everyone's memory, this feels a bit now like GCSE biology, for which I apologise. We've got my bad drawing of a plant. So in the middle of this flower, first off, I've got the ovules. So these are the egg cells that would turn into seeds, and the ovary, which houses them, which forms the fruit. You've then got this stalk, which is called the style, holding up the stigma. That's the sticky surface that the pollen will land on. And altogether, this inner part of the flower is the female part known as the carpel collectively. So then in the next outermost whirl of flower organs, we've got the anther, which is where the pollen's released from. Which is, you know, I think I drew these almost subconsciously like the lily ones that put pollen everywhere if you have an arrangement. And the filament, which is the long thin stalk that holds them up. And collectively they'd be the male stamens of the flower. Then going out into the next ring, you've got all the nice petals. And then the very most outer ring of the flower is the sepals, so those green parts that would seal up the flower safely in its bud before it opens. Then also just worth mentioning, at the base here, the receptacle is what all the parts of the flower are kind of sitting on, this kind of sort of slightly swollen end of the stem that the flower is all sitting on. So in amongst the snow showers this weekend, I went and tried to find myself some blossom to pick up and to start cutting up. So complete with an old kitchen chopping board and a quite blunt scalpel that I really should have sharpened. I'm going to cut some up. So you can quite nicely see the sepals on the outside of here, and 5 nice pink petals and loads of stamens in the middle. So I know a few botanist colleagues of mine who say that botanists can't count to over 12, because if you're following a key, it might give you stamens this many, that many, but beyond 12 it just says numerous or lots. So this is in the numerous category. I'm not going to count them. So here's my blunt scalpel. That really shouldn't have been as difficult as it was to cut into it. And I think I have to take off this petal so that we can see inside better. Yeah. So you can see all those nice white filaments of the stamens coming up from the flower, and that receptacle has sort of become a kind of cup shape that's holding the flower in place, and sat in the middle of it is that female part of the flower with the carpel, which has got one ovary down at the bottom and the stigma up at the top. So there we are. So I found another tree that was fairly similar to this, which I'm going to cut up next. This one was a bit more weather beaten by the hail and the snow. And again, you can see the sepals, but this time they'd be described as reflexed. So they're folded back away from the petals and back down the body of the receptacle here. And we've got the remains of the bud that these flowers have burst out of. So you're going to have to watch me ineptly cut some of these things off again. And then skip to one that works better. So again, you can see the bud scales quite nicely. So I think this one, the previous one was probably a cherry, and this one probably kind of cultivated variety of a stone plum, I think. And they're both quite related species, so they're in the same genus, and you can tell this when I open it up and look at it. You can see that same sort of cup shape that the female part of the flower is sat in, with the ovary sat there at the bottom. There we go. So I think, do I do any more fiddling to this one? Not really. So we've got 5 petals, numerous stamens, and the middle, and so that's it, looking down a hand lens. So then, by comparison then, these are the pear tree blossoms that I nabbed from off campus. So again, we've still got the 5 sepals, and we've got 5 beautiful white petals. Probably not quite as many stamens under that numerous stamens category. But these ones look quite different when I chop them up. So take off some petals so that it's easier to see. There we go. So looking at the top there, it's got 2 styles. So there's a V shape here, and so it's got 2 stigmatic surfaces there for the pollen to land on. And this bit here at the base, this receptacle, is completely solid. So we've not got that cup structure, we've got a solid lump at the back of the flower. So if I try and cut into it with my blunt knife, there we go. You can see that the ovary is embedded in this sort of top of the stem. So the receptacle has sort of swallowed up the ovary and sealed it in. So I make a little cut down the side of the ovary, just there, and then I think I speed it on a bit. This is what it looks like down a hand lens. Then you can see here's the ovary and this is the receptacle, and it's all sealed in across here at the top, which is more convincing on this picture. And you can see it's kind of shiny, probably because that's the nectar that the plant would be providing to the insects that are visiting it. So if I go back to my lovely botanical prints, this one is a prunus cherry, and this one is a pyrus a pear. And so you can see, looking at, they've got the flower diagrams showing that difference. And of course, because blossom and fruit are so closely linked, you can carry on seeing these characteristics of the flowers when you're eating the fruit. So particularly if you're thinking about apples and pears, when you're eating them and you get that sort of line around the middle as you're approaching the core, that is showing the sort of change between the fruit tissue that's swollen up from the stem, the fruit tissue that has swollen up from the ovary in there. So it's showing that there were kind of two layers in the flower that have turned into the fruit. And then also what you see on things like apples and pears is that brown bit at the end, with it's usually got 5 little points to it, because this is where the flower was attached. And so you're looking at the dried up remnants of the flower and the sepals at the back of that. So you can tell quite a lot by pulling some flowers apart. But where plants put all those various bits has been quite a conundrum for scientists for a long time. And this is the plant that they use to answer all questions in plant science. So if anyone came to my talk about pavement plants, you'll have seen this picture before, but this is the workhorse of all plant science laboratories. So it's small, it's easy to grow, it moves quickly through its life cycle from seed to flower to seed. You can produce thousands of seeds from one plant. It's got a really small genome and it's quite a simple little plant. And it grows all over the world, whether that's native or naturalized, and it's got a huge amount of variety. So sort of just looking at leaves of plants that grow in different places, you can see how different these are. It sort of accumulates different genetic mutations. So this is what its flower looks like. It's quite simple, but you can see those 4 whorls quite clearly. So from the female part, the male part, petals, and the sepals. So people started looking at mutated seeds, growing them on and looking for plants which had flowers which looked atypical. So what they're doing is looking at trying to work out how this meristem tissue at the top here decides which bit of the flower it's going to put in what place. And so if you imagine this is like a little dome of cells, in 1988, 2 scientists came up with this theory called the ABC theory of flower development. So if you imagine you've got this dome of cells and we've got this kind of bullseye target drawn on top of it. What you've got on the outer edge of this area of cells is genes expressing this kind of A function, which is saying grow things that grow at the outside of flowers. And then in the center, you've got genes which are saying grow the kind of organs which grow in the middle of flowers. And then you've got this third gene being expressed in giving the bullseye kind of pattern, which modifies the action of the other 2. So where you get A and B, you get a particular result, and where you've got a combination of B and C acting on a cell, you get a different result. So this would mean that where a group of genes that have an A function are working, you get a sepal. If the cell is experiencing A and B genes, it puts out a petal. C and B genes, it puts out the stamen. But if it's just the C, then it puts this carpel and the female part of the plant right in the middle. So people have been looking at these mutations in Arabidopsis to find genes which have these sort of functions. So here we've got some where we've got flowers that are putting loads of green stuff out. So these are all sepals and extra carpels and so on. And we've got ones where we've got extra petals, so loads and loads of petals going in there. So why am I talking to you about strange aspects of plant floral development this late on a Wednesday night? And that's because if you've got a bud, this meristem will carry on being at the end of the bud. But if you've got a flower, that's it. It comes to an end. All of those cells are going to develop into something floral. So there's a limited number of cells in this meristem that can, although they're capable of becoming anything, there's not, you know, there's not an infinite number of them. So if you've got, what happens in order to get more petals then, is that you've got more of these A-type genes working across a bigger area of that dome of cells. And so you've got fewer places where you've got the action of those C-type genes. So where you've got more A and B working together, you put in more petals, but you've got less of B and C working together, and so you lose things like the stamens. So the upshot of this is that if you've got a flower with more petals, you haven't just made new petals from nowhere, you've swapped some cells from turning into some other kind of part of the flower and made them turn into petals. So if we go back to our blossom, I've got something that looks like a kind of wild cherry on the left, and on the top right, I've got the Kansan cultivar of cherry. So this is the one that you get in parks and gardens and around housing estates as the giant explosion of pink that I wanted my photograph taken underneath. So this one has 5 petals, this wild type sort of cherry. Kansan can have 20 to 50 petals. So if you're thinking about this in terms of what's going on in the flower, you've lost some of the other organs that the flower would have been producing in favour of putting out all these wonderful showy petals. So I found this recent study from Poland where people had looked at the double flowers of Kansan versus a semi-double flower of something similar to the one I found outside the car park in Manchester. So rather than 5 petals, it's got maybe 7 to 12. And they analysed the pollen and the nectar rewards that this was giving to pollinators. And what they found was that these semi-doubles were producing 2.5 times more pollen if they sort of multiplied it up to a similar sized tree, and about 6 times more sugar. So by having these really beautiful ones with loads and loads of petals, it really demonstrates why these double flowers are not as good for pollinators, because we're losing those organs that are interesting for the pollinators to come and visit. And indeed, they also found fewer insects were visiting those flowers that gave them fewer rewards. So we're coming up to the end and question time, really. So if anyone would like to come in and see anything that I've got, when we're allowed to, I would love to welcome you in to come and look at some of the collection. And a lot of what I've been showing you today has been from our Cultivated Plants collection, which is more of a kind of archive of clippings and pictures and plants from gardens, which is courtesy of this gentleman, Leo Grindon, who is one of our collectors, he's the one we think we'd quite like to sit by his fireside and drink sherry, because he looks like he's got a tall tale or two that he wants to share. And indeed, he was an author. He wrote a number of books, one of which was this one, Fruits and Fruit Trees. So I was really hoping that he'd have loads of material that I'd be able to use for this talk. But just by the by, if we change Englishmen to British people, I'm really sort of depressed to realise that I fit into the stereotype of thinking foremost about an apple. But at the end of his chapter on apples, he puts this, which is, apple culture in England will not have attained its proper status until another great fact is recognised and acted upon, namely the inexpressible value of fruit trees in general as decorative or ornamental objects. So that explains why I couldn't find as much about blossom as I could about fruit in his collections, and he was obviously disappointed that that's what he was finding when he was putting all the material together as well. But I'd like to think, as a kind of, he was a Bristolian who adopted Manchester in his 20s and lived here for the rest of his life. I'd like to think that he would be pleased to walk around the city and find plenty of pleasant walks these days with all the fruit trees that are out there to enjoy their blossom early in the year, as well as the fruit later on. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening to me on this Wednesday evening. And if you've got any questions or comments, please throw them out in the chat.
Yes, so thank you so much, Rachel. That was really, really interesting. Really enjoyed that. So yes, please, we've got the Q&A and we've got the chat. So pop your questions in there and then I'll ask them to both Rachel and Andy. Andy can answer lots of tree questions as well if you have anything more general or anything about City of Trees. So we've had one come through for you, Rachel. Someone asked,
petals.
Could you clarify, yeah, is it more petals that are in the cherry blossoms, the less attractive useful for insects, or is it the other way around?
Yeah, sorry. So in general, the more petals you've got, the less useful it is to a pollinator. So if you've got more petals in the flower, you've got fewer stamens producing pollen, and it seems you might also have less nectar being produced in the flower based on that study. So although you've got a huge mass of flowers all the way across the tree, each individual flower, if it's got loads of petals in it, is giving you less than if it was just the kind of wild looking variety of the tree. So, you know, that's why something like hawthorn in the hedges is so good for bees, because it's you know, if you've got the ordinary single variety, it's giving out lots of reward to the pollinators visiting it.
Thank you for clarifying. And Harriet asked, does the university ever ask you what trees to plant on campus?
Actually, yes. So we've got a living campus plan, which is about making the campus nice for visitors, for students, for staff, and of course for biodiversity. So I helped to draw up the plan that recommended what kind of plants we should put in when we're putting in new areas of planting. I think it's up for review though this year, so there'll be a new one going in. It'd be interesting to see what kind of changes they make.
And sorry, nice comment from Alison. She said, just looking at your workplace, Phil, made me feel relaxed. It's beautiful. Thank you for sharing your vast knowledge. And I'm very jealous that you got to work in such a beautiful environment. It looked lovely.
It is a very lovely place, yes.
So we've got, this might be one for Andy perhaps, but I'll ask it and we'll go from there. So it's from Jana. Could you explain how a tree decides to produce a blossom instead of a leaf?
If I'm honest, I don't think I can, but I think Rachel probably can. Rachel.
So I think there's partly there's the kind of inbuilt preference for a species. So like we've noticed that things like Blackthorne puts out blossoms before it puts out leaves, whereas something like an apple is putting out leaves and then the blossom comes in the middle. And so there'll be, once they start making those buds, there'll be a particular kind of developmental pathway that the tree is following to make those kind of new embryonic baby structures. And so that will be a sequence of genes that are turned on in order, and so quite a kind of cascade. So one will turn on others, which will turn on others, and so it's directing them down a particular pathway to produce a particular organ. And so that's going to be different in species that are going to produce blossom first, or ones which produce leaves first. But then it also might be kind of changed. If your tree, like my poor witch hazel, has had a bad year, it'll probably think, well, I'm going to need leaves next year. First off, I'm going to use most of my sugar for making new leaves, rather than going to the trouble of making really expensive, energetically expensive flowers. And so that pathway can obviously be kind of changed slightly and tweaked depending on the kind of environment that the plant is experiencing.
Great, thank you. And then Fang has asked, do you know what the trees are in St. Peter's Square that have the bluish flowers before the leaves?
I do, they're lovely. Go on, Andy.
Are we talking about the Paulonia?
Yes, the Paulonia, yeah. So they're a type of foxglove, Andy, is that right?
Yeah, I think it's also called the foxglove tree. Yes, yes, they are rather stunning because they are quite huge flowers. You don't expect them to see on a tree.
And kind of an
especially in the city
unusual
centre.
colour in this country as well, isn't it?
I've heard that they're quite difficult because they're planted in St Peter's Square. So in St Peter's Square, Manchester, for people who don't know, there's a really, really tall building. It's quite well surrounded because they don't like the frost and they don't like the cold. It's quite a bold strategy to plant them, but obviously it's well protected.
They're doing quite well though, aren't they? And as Julie says, they do have those huge leaves. I was there one spring. I was there trying to take a photo of them on my phone, and this chap walked past me, and I was there with my phone. He's like, "Get a life," as he walked past. I think he must have thought I was trying to get like the perfect selfie angle or something. And you're like, "No, but the tree, honest, the tree's really interesting. Can I bore you about the tree?"
Well, Paulownia is the type of foxglove, and they are really, really beautiful. So Mark has asked, could you tell us a little bit more about what has happened to many of the magnolia tree flowers during the recent frosts? What impact has this had on them, and when will they recover?
So what has mainly happened is that it has frazzled the petals because they're really delicate. So the bits that, the kind of working parts of the flower, the male and female organs, are probably hopefully less affected because they were kind of protected a bit by the petals and the sepals. But it does mean that they won't get, they might not attract as many insects to them, but particularly beetles visit magnolia trees. So I think sadly they're going to look a bit sad, drop all their petals, and then they might not make quite as much fruit come the autumn. If you have any thoughts on that, Andy?
Apologies, I was typing answers to the Paulownia spelling. Sarah beat me to it. Yeah, I don't think there's, we see it. I've seen it in my front garden with the with camellias we've got planted out there. They're forever getting frosted, and it sometimes makes you think that one of the things that I wonder is when I look at things that either coming into leaf or coming into blossom are the trees responding to daylight length, or are they responding to temperature, or are they responding to both? And the kind of pros and cons of your strategy in terms of am I going to take advantage of an early warm patch, but I'm at high risk of getting myself frost damaged, or do I be a bit more conservative perhaps and wait till it's definitely warmer, or go on day length? I don't know the answer to all that, but I find it kind of fascinating that obviously plants have got different strategies for how they approach that.
And I think that answers Alison Crook's question as well about, are you still learning? The answer is yes. So all the time, and that's one of them. I wouldn't know either with the magnolias whether they're responding to temperature or day length as a kind of major signal to start doing something. But probably there's someone out there who's been studying it for years, and you can find that information if you go rummaging through enough places and find interesting things. So yes, there is plenty I don't know and still need to learn. Things about surprising and interesting. I don't know really. I mean, I think with trees, it's one of the things I find so interesting about trees is thinking about it, because I work in a museum. There's a huge fossil tree root in the geology gallery, and it's not a tree as we'd know it because it's actually a giant club moss, but there's obviously something that is really successful about choosing to look like a tree. It's quite a good way of being alive for a plant, because it's evolved multiple times in different groups to be a big woody structure. So I'd like to know, it's kind of what's interesting for a plant about why it's good to be a tree over everything else.
Great. And I think I don't think we've got any more questions, unless anyone has any final questions to pop in the chat. or the Q&A, we will let Rachel get a very, very well-deserved nice cup of tea. Done a lot of talking, it's been brilliant. But if you do have any follow-up questions, you can email them to me. So I'll be emailing everyone with a link to the recording if you wanted to share that, as well as a short survey. So just wanted to say thank you very much to Rachel, and thanks to Andy from City of Trees as well, just for jumping on and help answer your questions and doing the quiz. Hope you all had a lovely evening. And yeah, thank you very much, and we'll follow up. But any further questions, do give us a shout. So thank you.
And thank you all for listening to me. I think you all